Safetifying from interpersonal violence through phasic protective sequencing. Endangering. Endangering with interpersonal violence through contingent contextual conditioning. First of all, you have the elite. The elite interact with the people, causing endangerment. The elite use various tools in order to effect what they wish to achieve in their lives. The first is politics. Then comes inferiority projection. Then legislation, enforcement, and town planning. The people, they have various subconditions under which they basically exist. And the one is socialization, then cultural norms, alcohol use, patriarchizing, and poverty. So these tools of the elite and subconditions of the people, they interact with each other in a reciprocal loop, and they mutually amplify each other. And what comes out of this process is endangerment. And endangerment can be characterized or represented through organized crime, assault, rape, domestic violence, farm attack, shooting, stabbing, etc. So the condition number one and condition number two, the first condition being the elite and the second condition the people, these, as I said, mutually amplify each other and reciprocally loop with each other, and they conjuncturally cause in a frequent manner the production of endangerment. So how does politics actually get involved in this? Well, I think we all know what the elite do. If you consider over the last few years what the elite do and how they utilize politics in order to influence the people. When they use their various political, call them shenanigans or approaches, they inevitably exercise them through what we call inferiority projection. In other words, they are the bosses, they're in charge, they have the high ground, and the people must basically submit. Then the elite also use legislation. If you read between the lines within legislation, you can see that essentially what they are trying to do, or what they're saying their legislation is trying to effect, does not actually get effected or get sorted out through that legislation. It's almost like the legislation is written ineffectually, and you have to look at the various, I know in the USA, some of these large bills that go before Congress, they interpolate various things to their own advantage, the elite, within those bills. And you literally have to sift through, I don't know if it's tens of thousands of pages, but it's a lot of actual legal writing to find out exactly what it is that they're trying to basically sweep under the carpet in terms of approval. So legislation can be used in a very manipulative way by the elite in order to get what they want to do, and also a lot of legislation is just purely ineffectual. It's almost like, okay, so they and the people that they use to write the legislation, that they don't really know how to solve a particular problem, but they just throw so many words at it and so much speculation and what looks like informed background and principles that they want to put into law. They just basically put a whole lot of things together, and then they expect it to actually function. And if you look at the results of a lot of legislation, you will see that they have not achieved what they set out to achieve, especially when it comes to, for example, anti-domestic violence legislation and that type of thing. And then with the elite, they use enforcement. So again, we can think of the last few years of how various rules about not being able to buy alcohol, not being able to buy cigarettes, having to stay at home, wear masks, all of that. That kind of inferiority projection is done through the enforcement of legislation, which is to the advantage of the elite and disadvantage of the people. And then town planning, the way that towns and cities and that are laid out, one has to consider how uncomfortable and how inconveniently structured and placed so many little towns and larger cities, how they are planned and how they are laid out, which does not really make it convenient for people and conducive to communal living, or let's say community living and communication and that type of thing. It's very segmented, and in a sense, one would have to research this more, but in a sense, what we're suggesting here is that the elite use the way they have their town planners plan towns in order to have advantage of control and lesser conduciveness for the people. When it comes to the people, there's socialization, the way that we are brought up and the way that we are taught and the way we are encouraged to believe about ourselves. This creates certain aspects in a person's mind and certain approaches in a person's way of life, which, when impinged upon by the elite's inferiority projection and their political legislative enforcement and town planning, that the people's reaction, okay, from the way they've been socialized, their reaction can result in the people becoming violent or the elite becoming violent. Cultural norms, various cultural norms of the woman's place is like in the kitchen, behind the stove, having babies. And I'm not saying that that is not an option if you want to choose to do that, but in order to make women feel that they have to do that, that that's their role, or that they have to go out and work, just using that as an example for cultural norms. These cultural norms, again, can be manipulated by the elite, and the way that the people may react through the lens or through the understanding of those cultural norms might result in one way or another in endangerment or in actual manifestation of violence. Alcohol use, one doesn't really need to comment too much on that, because alcohol use or abuse can lead to a lot of violence within relationships and families and communities. And yes, so that comes mostly from the people, but then the government does supply the alcohol, the elite, essentially, at the end of the day. Patriarchizing, when men just think that they have the right to be in charge of everything and abuse that right, especially with the interaction and use, for example, of alcohol and a cultural norm of the men are in charge to the extent the men might be in charge of certain things, but to the extent that they oppress and hurt the lives of other men, women, and children. And then, of course, poverty, grinding poverty or any level of poverty. If you don't have things, you don't have food, and so on, it's a tension and a stress on the human system, and it can lead to violence from the people and can exacerbate any kind of ill effect that the elite are exercising onto the people. So just to recap before we maybe go into this in a bit more detail in another video, the people, through those various elements, interacting with the elite and the elite putting pressure on the people, can result in endangerment, which may manifest itself in organized crime, assault, rape, domestic violence, farm attack, shooting, and stabbing.